So, summer of 2021, this was a sort of crazy time for the Solana network. I think for the most time, people were just starting to learn about what Solana was, what you could do with it. Serum was the first central limit order book built on chain. And then out of nowhere comes this idea that there's going to be an NFT standard on the Solana network. And, in the course of just a few months, this goes from ideation to the launch of DJ and Ape Academy and all of these early projects that launched on the network. And this was all made possible by a group no one had ever heard of before called Metaplex and this contract called the token metadata contract. And now we fast forward to 2024. There's been incredible upgrades to that, whether that's, greater functionality to Gumdrop to Bubblegum for compressed NFTs to now this new standard you guys have released called Core. I think there's a ton to get into today about protocol standards versus application level standards versus sort of soft network standards, how the very different evolution of Solana came about for both NFT specs and specs in general than you see in other networks. And we have Stephen Hess here to talk about it, who was there at the beginning, has been leading the charge at Metaplex since 2021, and really glad to have you in studio today.
Thanks, Austin. It's great to be here. Definitely think back to the original Solana summer often. Feels like we're very much in the throes of season 2 as well. So it's been really exciting to see the renewed interest in crypto, but obviously Solana as well. I think, as you know, and as we know well, the teams that put their head down in the bear market are really in an incredible opportunity. And so we're excited to be part of that.
Yeah, and there's a lot of building that's happened since summer of 2021, especially on the Metaplex side. So there's a bunch of stuff I want to get into today. I kind of want to start off with a bit of an overview from you of what does the scope of the NFT ecosystem look like on Solana? What are some of the tools and different parts of the Metaplex, both foundation and the labs organization that are working on different things in the space? And kind of what's the scope of what you guys work on?
Yeah, absolutely. So for those that aren't familiar, Metaplex is a community-governed digital asset protocol. We're best known for introducing the first Solana NFT standard, but we've had the opportunity to continue to innovate on the base level technology with compressed NFTs, programmability, which is now the default system for royalty enforcement across chains, and then most recently with the introduction of Core, which is this consolidation into a single account asset. And through that journey, we've had the opportunity to work with just this incredible community of artists and creators and builders. And we see NFTs really providing, at the base level, the social fabric of the ecosystem. And most recently, we've seen this huge explosion of meme coins. And there's this view that NFTs are dead, that, now the metas have moved on. But if you look closely, it's actually these NFT communities that are oftentimes benefiting most from the airdrops of these new tokens. They're helping bootstrap and launch these new projects. And so I think fundamentally, that social glue has been really critical to just the overall, excitement, energy, and activity in the ecosystem. If you drill down into the numbers, NFTs are almost as far and wide within Solana and Solana itself. There's over 40 million wallets now that hold a Metaplex NFT. In last month in March, there was over 700,000 unique signers to the Metaplex protocol, and close to 100 million transactions. So close to 12% of all the transactions on the network, related to digital assets and NFTs. Using Metaplex. So I'm really excited because I think that we're entering the part of the stage where we're going to see a lot of new people come into crypto. And I think these NFT communities are the perfect jumping off point. And I think we'll see a lot, sort of a resurgence of interest as the tent widens. And our hope is to be a supportive part of that.
Yeah. And you guys, at the foundation have built a bunch of different types of tools over the years to sort of help the NFT ecosystem evolve. Walk me through, what does that tool set look like nowadays?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way I would think about Metaplex is that it's a framework and a platform for creating, managing, and using digital assets. And at the base layer, we have what's called the digital asset standard. And that's a point of view about how the data related to assets and the functionality of and behavior of those assets should work. That standard is then implemented across several different programs. So
Yeah.
token metadata, Bubblegum, which is the baseline program for compressed NFTs, and now Core. And they're individual programs, but we've also built technology that helps there be a plurality of asset programs. And so we have what's called the Digital Asset Standard API, the DOS API, which is now run by almost all of the leading RPC providers. And it provides a single interface for application developers to access the data regardless of the program that's implementing that standard.
Right.
And so that really opens up the creative space where now you have, new takes on how digital assets can work, and a pipeline by which application developers can integrate those without having to integrate a totally new standard ultimately in terms of how that data is represented.
Yeah, I think for frequent listeners of the show, I've talked before about how the launch of Metaplex was actually like one of those perfect encapsulations of how you can have a theory about what people want, and you can have a theory about a product vision. And, going back to the launch of Metaplex, almost everything that folks thought about the original vision of Metaplex was wrong. Right? It was this idea that what every artist really wanted was their own storefront. What every artist really wanted was the ability to run auctions for price discovery. That was really important that everything was fully on chain from like the front end to, the media to all these sorts of things. And almost all of that ended up being not the direction that the Solana community chose to take it. But because these things were built in modules, it was not one waterfall monolithic project. The core functionality of token metadata lived on. And it was that piece that everyone said, oh, this is actually what we really want. We don't actually want storefronts. We don't actually want auctions. We want, a bunch of tooling to expand that. But then, from there, it's like Metaplex picks up where it finds product market fit and then builds out a whole bunch of other tools to make that even better, right? And that goes into Candy Machine, right, which was sort of like the dominant NFT whitelist minting system for a while, into protected NFTs and programmable NFTs with royalty enforcements. And so talk to me a little bit about that process of like finding where there's product market fit and deciding what tooling and what sort of feature set is worth building out versus also having your own vision at the foundation for where you'd like the space to evolve into.
It's a great point. I do think that gets lost in hindsight sometimes, is that Metaplex started out with a creator-centered vision. It was born from conversations with NFT artists on Ethereum that were frustrated with the centralized launchpad approach to distribution. Like, they were having to go through Nifty Gateway, they were having to wait for weeks, they were complaining about not getting paid on time. And we looked at the current market and asked ourselves the question every Solana builder should ask, which is, what can you do that's only possible on Solana? And we identified an opportunity to build what's effectively a WordPress style product for deploying and spinning up your own NFT marketplace, like really living and pursuing this idea of decentralization, which is that you as an artist can spin up your own marketplace and get direct distribution. It turns out that in order to build that, you need an NFT standard. And so we built an NFT standard. And also, I think, arguably really the first pattern for building a web application on Solana that was fully open source. And so what that ended up producing, which was unexpected at the time, was that we started building what at this point is one of the largest Web3 developer communities around this technology, that was looking at the standard. It was looking at how the application was structured and built, using that as a template to then go build all sorts of different applications on the network. And I think as we've gone through the project, we've realized and come to really appreciate and focus on the impact that we've had with developers, and also like our importance, the importance of our responsibility to like really focus on the developer.
Yeah.
And so if anything has changed sort of fundamentally, I would say, the vision is still the same. It's like building a digital asset economy, creating peer-to-peer commerce infrastructure, decentralizing commerce broadly, but a focus and a doubling down on the developer platform, the on-chain programming, the standard, the tools that are going to enable dozens, hundreds, thousands of different types of applications that are interfacing with that core technology.
Yeah, I think this is like one of those pieces that is, as you're saying, is like it's lost in hindsight, or the history of how things evolve is like things are often remembered for their successes, right? But it is usually a process of like intense iteration to find that thing that has product market fit, that cracks open a market a little bit, and then you just pour everything possible through that hole, and like that becomes the entire product category. So at the beginning, the sort of vision for Metaplex was this sort of, I wouldn't call it vertically integrated, but this integrated stack where you had sort of the creator and application level on top, where you had, minting tools and, storefronts and these sorts of things. And at this point, you guys have sort of decided to take the protocol in a bit of a different direction, where the work that the foundation does is very much on that base layer smart contract development and like developer tooling. How is that process both internally of figuring out like this is what we want to focus on, this is what we want to hand off to other teams? Talk to me a little bit about that process to say like the stuff Metaplex should be focusing on for the long term is more technical and more low level.
Ultimately, it's we view it as a really encouraging development, which is that in the beginning, the number of use cases for NFTs was fairly narrow. So it's appropriate then to build point solutions that are more vertically integrated in that sense. It's like, okay, here are the on-chain programs, here are the SDKs, here's the front-end implementation, you can deploy it, maybe customize it. But now we've seen just this huge explosion of use cases, especially with the cost reduction that's come from compression, where we have on-chain communities, we have digital artists, we have social applications, we have games, we have RWAs, we have marketplaces, we have wallets, we have borrowing and lending protocols, we have hybrid NFTs that are moving back between fungible and non-fungible assets. And in that world, the highest leverage work that we can do is building great developer tools. So great SDKs, like it's the small things often that matter with developer platforms. It's like the documentation is good. If you have a question, you can get an answer quickly. You have guides that will step you through. Your error handling is sharp. And so we really think that the way that we can add the most value at this part in the technology lifecycle is really providing enablement for developers. And frankly, it's been really exciting for us because that brings new ideas, new creative energy. It's changed the cadence of our work, where I think one part of it that I really love that I do less of is like the direct work with creators, but more work with the builders that are then unlocking and opening up these brand new industries that are getting disrupted by digital assets for the first time.
Yeah, so I think that's a very natural progression for any protocol that's maturing, right? You see that Solana Foundation very much went through this as well, where like the amount of work that we do with teams building at the application level is much lower than it was back in 2021, right? Now it's much more work with Jito and Firedancer and these sort of core contributor teams that are building very close to the protocol level and the protocol level itself. One of the challenges there, and you hear this from the folks at Anza all the time, right, is that you are now pretty far removed from the user. So how do you guys actually go about the feature discovery, for lack of a better term, to say like we are heads down on building like new NFT standards and tooling? There might now be 2 or 3 application layers in between you and the creator who's actually issuing an NFT, or the trader who's, actually buying an NFT. So talk to me about product feedback and sort of how you guys keep your eyes on how the market's evolving.
It's a great question. I do think that the common mistake for developer platforms is to take a very theoretical view on the technology. It's like, this is disrupting by providing like,
Sure.
whatever. Where what you really need is a very strong point of view on the use cases for that developer platform. And so that would be like, I think the core idea is that being a developer platform doesn't excuse you from having a strong point of view of what the end user market looks like. You still have to have conviction. You still have to go through the process of design and discovery and understanding, empathizing, like staying very close to those users. And so I think the way that shows up for myself is like, you know, you just have to be out there in the field. It's like, you know, in Discord, on Telegram, like responding to DMs on Twitter. And, you know, had the sort of, you know, been fortunate to develop relationships in the artist community and in these other areas where, you know, I have trusted relationships where they can come to me and be like, you're missing this whole huge part of the field and here's how. So it's almost like maybe what I've learned is to develop a few of these like super nodes into these different industries that are helping me keep pace with like what's the latest meta. So, you know, I'll have like the friend that I talk to who I know is like, you know, knee deep in meme coins, and he'll read me in on like what is the latest trend, like what, you know, what's happening.
Right.
And yeah, I think that's important because of how fast things move. Like building a successful crypto project is a combination of having like a 10 to 100 year vision that's durable, where you have a problem you can sink your teeth in for a long period of time and find creative inspiration from, but then also like riding waves and like staying very close to like how the ground is currently shifting and positioning yourself to take advantage of that.
Yeah, it's funny to talk about that way, because I think one of the things that's sort of core to Metaplex's DNA is controversy. You know, and I think this is an area where you're laughing.
Not in our official brand guide.
But like even the launch of, you know, programmable NFTs was something that was seen as quite controversial, where this was a feature set that certain artists and projects really wanted and felt they needed. And sort of to take us back to that time, this is when, you know, for 6 weeks there was something called Yaw, which was this marketplace that, you know, famously decided it was going to not respect the royalties that were written into an NFT metadata, but were not enforceable in any sort of traditional sense. They were socially enforceable, but they were not technically enforceable. And so programmability was this sort of extension on top of that said, hey, we're going to actually build a bunch of programmable features into this. And one of those programmable features was royalty enforcement. But that was not without controversy. So I think this was sort of the first time that I can think of that you guys took an opinionated stance on what the future of this technology should look like that was not necessarily a consensus opinion at the time. How did you guys get comfortable internally and then externally saying, you know, we're going to become a little bit more opinionated in how we think this stuff should evolve and the tooling we need to build, as opposed to just building sort of, you know, the type of stuff you'd been doing before, which was very optional tooling?
Ultimately, I think you have to make decisions as an organization that are customer driven, they're user driven, and they're focused on your vision. And so while royalty enforcement was a controversial topic, in terms of our own internal decision-making process, it was actually pretty clear what we had to do in that moment, which is in talking to creators, the incentive alignment between their collector base and their project, which royalty enforcement provided, was fundamental. It wasn't optional.
Sure.
It was functional to what allowed them to continue to reinvest and work for years and decades building the community and the project around that collection. And so when you're in a situation like that, I think you have to be true to yourself. Like that is the durable nucleus to any successful project is, do you have a strong conviction on the problem that you're solving and who you exist to serve? And if you can answer that definitively, then I think you can weather any storm. I do feel like we've been proven right. And I know maybe this is gonna end up in the comments with people disagreeing. But we didn't see the full collapse of Solana NFTs, like as people were foreshadowing. Like programmability, like no one's going to ever touch an NFT that has programmability. Who's going to want an NFT that does that? You are killing Solana NFTs. Like this was quite literally the other side of the debate at the time. And in this year, like in December, we flipped all of Ethereum for secondary trading volume with royalty enforcement. And the other argument that was made at the time is this is going to kill liquidity. This is going to kill trading,
right?
Because you now have this extra friction attached to the transaction. And we've seen the opposite. We've seen that royalty enforcement creates valuable assets that are not just beneficial for the creator, they're beneficial for the collector, they're beneficial for the marketplaces, for the traders that are providing liquidity into the ecosystem. And so, ultimately, we view programmability as a key primitive to the NFT ecosystem that's here to stay. And not only has it now been normalized, we now see other chains adopting similar concepts using the same terminology. And so, we think that like most things in Solana NFTs, like we were at the tip of the spear, and really could not have pulled that off without broad support from the creator community. So I think they also deserve a lot of credit here. Like we definitely took our fair share of shots and controversy over this. But I think also the creators standing up for their conviction and being okay with some collectors walking away from their projects in order to double down and be able to provide value to their core supporters has ended up making the ecosystem healthier.
Yeah, this is something I remember tweeting something around the yaw marketplace debate, for lack of a better term, that was like royalty circumvention is immoral. And 70% of the comments were negative from traders. And I think what we've seen is that exactly what you said. This allowed projects to weather through the bear market. It allowed them to maintain enough funds to actually keep development going, because otherwise, in the late stage of many NFT projects, there are diverse revenue streams. In the non-late stage, in the early stage and mid stage, there's just one, and that is largely royalties. And so if you remove those sorts of things, I think we probably would have seen a lot more projects that couldn't last out the bear market if they didn't have a royalty stream. I want to kind of take this to the next piece of, let's call it, controversial Metaplex history, which was the process to actually go and look at the future of token metadata. Token metadata was at the time, and still is today, but it's been diversified through Bubblegum and now Core that we'll talk about in a minute. It was the fundamental underpinnings of all of the NFTs on Solana, or 99.9% of the NFTs on Solana. And you guys made a decision that we supported from the foundation, but you guys made a decision to say we were going to add a whole series of protocol fees to token metadata. I think in retrospect, this is something that has allowed Metaplex to have a sustainable revenue source for the foundation that has actually been able to help with additional protocol development. And I kind of want to talk about a bunch of that. But going back to that moment where you guys said, hey, we are building an open source public good, but that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be free. How did you guys get comfortable with that? What were the conversations with artists and marketplaces and collectors about? That is a decision that I'm sure was not made lightly.
That's right. And I think in many ways it represented a key component to what we view to be the standard for building digital asset protocols. We think that digital asset protocols are a fundamental and important category in Web3. And that that work should be funded. But the collection of fees, the fee amounts, the development of the protocol should ultimately be community governed. Yeah. So you're right, there isn't this inherent conflict between those two ideas. Protocols can have fees and also be public goods and community governed. And that's our focus.
Famously, every blockchain has fees.
That's right.
They're called gas fees.
Exactly. That's right. And the question is does it create a closed loop? And that's ultimately our goal as well, is that there's a closed loop between the protocol, the users, the token holders, and the fees. And that is the vision of having a fully decentralized digital asset economy, is that the organizations like the Metaplex Foundation that are playing key roles today are able to decentralize and hand over more of that authority to the DAO and to the community progressively over time. And so that's really what I view as my job ultimately.
So those who've been watching Metaplex kind of for years, there's the two components that most people are familiar with. There's the Metaplex Foundation, where you work and a bunch of the core protocol developers are employed through. There's what we might call the labs component, which is Metaplex Studios. And then there's also this Metaplex DAO that exists. And you guys made a bunch of big changes and announcements over the last month around what the future of that DAO is and how Metaplex tokens are going to start playing into that as well. So I want to get into that as well. But, walk me through how these different pieces function within the Metaplex protocol world.
Yeah, so similar to like the structure of a Solana Labs and a Solana Foundation, or like a Consensus and Ethereum Foundation, Metaplex was set up with a U.S. company called Metaplex Studios, which has been building at the application layer, and so best known for Creator Studio, now called Truffle. Metaplex Foundation, where I'm one of two directors, we're focused primarily on the on-chain protocol, so the standard, the SDKs, the DOS API, and helping build the larger ecosystem, token economy, and decentralized governance of the protocol. And so now, really, Metaplex Studios and Truffle is just one of many applications that are built on top of the platform. And you'll see Metaplex really doubling down on developers and building out developer tools to enable, as I said before, what we expect to be hundreds and dozens of applications.
Nice. And so how does the DAO fit into all of this?
The DAO ultimately is the most important organization in that ecosystem. The goal is to transition all meaningful decision-making, including the fees and the placement of fees and the usage of fees, to the DAO, which is governed by token holders. And today, the protocol is governed by the DAO. Anyone in the community can make a proposal to change or modify the functionality of Metaplex, including our new program core.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll continue to see the DAO becoming that central decision-making body, but also the forum by which controversial topics are debated, discussed, and ultimately decided upon.
Yeah. So I think DAOs are interesting, right? DAOs, there's a little bit of a tyranny of the masses that can take effect in a DAO. You mentioned the DAO is in part token weighted in terms of how it operates, but the incentives of token holders don't necessarily line up with the incentives of creators. Oftentimes, the people who are holding tokens are not necessarily the same people minting on a network. I think, one of the sort of classic examples of this is like, in the corporate world are things like share buybacks, which are very important to shareholders, but don't matter at all to the users of a company, right? Like Apple doing share buybacks does not make my iPhone any better. So how do you think about maintaining sort of a diverse feedback loop at the DAO?
So ultimately, for a DAO to be credible as a forum and decision-making body, it has to represent the users that it's serving. And so I do think that that's an important step in any DAO's development, is to make sure that the people that are impacted the most have a seat at the table. And so the DAO itself has a treasury of MPLX that it can use for grants to individual project teams, several of which have been given so far. It could implement rewards for the usage of certain types of programs and protocols. And so I think I'm looking forward to engaging with the DAO specifically on that topic. As you know, like there's another side of that, which is you don't want to be rewarding people that are just farming your protocol.
Right.
You don't want to be rewarding spammers, which is an issue we have to look out for because there's a lot of spam usage of NFTs. And you want to give tokens to the people that are going to provide the most value in a constructive way going forward. So it's also a tricky problem because it requires like some discretion, and there are ways of doing that that are ultimately counterproductive to that goal if they're not done, in a thoughtful way.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So talk to me about some of the changes that the DAO has sort of brought in along with core. So I think, pretty famously, you guys have had a token that represents Metaplex out in the market for a while. There hasn't been much utility or functionality attached to that token. The distribution was based on NFT usage and NFT creation and all those sorts of things. But, the token metadata fees are not paid in Metaplex token, these sorts of things. How has the uses of that token evolved over the years, and how has the DAO sort of like chosen to change what that looks like today?
Yeah, I'd encourage anyone who's interested to take a look at the proposals that are being submitted to the DAO. You can visit dao.metaplex.com. We also have a submission form at mip.metaplex.com. And most recently, we've had proposals related to editions, so making it easier for artists to list open editions in multiple marketplaces. We also had a proposal recently around spam NFTs and restricting usage of the bubblegum program that's common for NFT spam. And so I think you'll continue to see the DAO being used for those types of improvements to the protocol, functional changes, new additions. And most recently, the foundation has decided to take 50% of the fees that the protocol has generated, both historically and going forward, to convert to MPLX, which is then sent to the DAO. And that MPLX, then the DAO has the ability and discretion to distribute through rewards, through grants, through incentive programs. And so we're expecting there to be a really active conversation over the next several months. And, for anyone listening, would encourage you to weigh in on the discussion. This is a really key piece of infrastructure for the Solana community. And we want to make sure that the future of this protocol is in lockstep with the community that's using it and benefiting from it.
Yeah. So let's talk about Core. Core is this sort of new next generation vision for what NFTs can look like on Solana. This is sort of a first for you guys. Most of the work that's been done sort of initially since token metadata was either expanding product category with programmable NFTs. It was creating a new standard with compressed NFTs, but those were all sort of derivative of that sort of original token metadata program standard. So walk us through Core, what it is, how it's different, and sort of why you guys are proposing this as sort of a new generation of standard.
Core is really, I would say, perhaps the end of the NFT standards era and the beginning of the digital asset protocol era for Metaplex. And what I mean by that is NFTs, as we've known them to date, have largely been attaching metadata to fungible tokens. And so practically, with token metadata, that means you have these 5 Solana accounts, and you have complexity with managing all of the data related to a fungible token program. And so what Core does is it simplifies that. It stores all of the relevant data for the asset in a single account. And the result of that is an 85% improvement on minting costs and on compute. And in addition to that, it's much easier to work as a developer because you're not sort of flying around trying to manage data between these different accounts. And so we really think that Core is going to unlock this next wave of use cases that allows for the data to be in account space. It's accessible. It's like in the memory, in the RAM of the network, that you can write programs that key off of those attributes. You can CPI with the data easily, but it's in the most condensed, efficient form factor as possible, which will then allow for complex transactions like complex multi-burns, and then a plugin system which will allow developers to hook into any of the lifecycle events related to the token and program custom applications based off of that.
Yeah, talk to me a bit about the plugin modules. Is that sort of similar to like pre and post hooks in Uniswap?
I would think of it as more closely connected to like managing lifecycle events with the token. And royalty enforcement is an application of that. There are different flavors of royalty enforcement that could be enabled. So if you're looking at like only enforce royalties if it's being sold at a certain price level, for instance.
Interesting.
There's types of customization there that are now made easier. You can have transfer fees. You can have the data inside of the NFT changing when it's being transferred. And so it's interesting, like we've been listing out the use cases for this. And it's one of those situations where we have like 3 to 5 ideas that we think are reasonable, but because it's opening up such a large creative space, I'm expecting to be surprised here in terms of what developers are ultimately going to be able to do with this.
So you guys have made a ton of architectural improvements with Core and the way it works. So token metadata, 5 accounts, pretty heavy, pretty innovative for its time. Compression totally different structure because it's using Merkle trees and the data is actually stored on leaves. And let's get into how that works too in a bit. But with core, as you're saying, one account is sort of that core component for how that works. When you're talking about plugins and sort of those additional modules that connect, how does that relate to sort of the heaviness or the account usage of that program?
So ultimately, core does have one account. So going from 5 to 1, pretty considerable in terms of the cost savings, the compute savings, the ease of use. And then the plugins don't introduce new accounts. They just add data to that core account. And
Right.
part of the reason why we called it core is because we see that core data object being extended by plugins, but then also being integrated with across a number of different applications
Yeah.
with some simplicity.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you don't really call this an NFT standard anymore. Talk to me about kind of that expanded vision for what core could evolve into.
So we ultimately look at it as digital assets or perhaps even on-chain assets as a more precise term now that real-world assets are coming online and are being tokenized. NFTs are, in my view, they continue to be a really important term because they're one of the few crypto terms that's crossed into the mainstream.
Yeah.
But we think categorically that NFTs is fairly limiting in terms of what ultimately this technology will create. And so we do view like the broader mission and purpose of Metaplex to be enabling digital assets.
So when you guys were thinking about like the architecture for core, what was sort of important to build in to expand that vision beyond what we currently think of as NFTs and sort of that additional functionality you want to support a digital asset standard?
So third-party plugins, because they allow for programming actions based on any lifecycle event of the token, meaning transferring, update, any of those base instructions, you're opening up an entirely new set of use cases around rentals and subscriptions. You can have point systems where the data is directly tied into the asset itself. You can have game assets that are destroyed or revoked based on the behavior of the game. You can have custom royalty enforcement where the royalties are only collected in very specific situations instead of on every sale. And I would expect coming out of that, there will be a long tail of use cases that we haven't foreseen or view possible. And I think part of what's exciting for us is really just opening up as much of that low-level functionality so that innovation process can start.
Yeah, it's interesting when you talk about it that way, the idea of like an NFT being something special. Like you could almost think about it the other way, that the special thing is actually like USDC, like a fully fungible token that the individual unit truly doesn't matter. In the future of blockchain, that may be a more rare occurrence than what we think of now as sort of the rare occurrence of a token where the specifics of it matter a lot.
Yeah, almost the distinction is like is how it moves through time. Like something can start fungible and then can pick up characteristics to it. So like there's a big difference between USDC and like a single dollar bill. And if I was to like, draw a heart on my dollar bill,
Right.
that now imbues it with unique characteristics. And so I do think we'll probably see more fluidity between those types. I think like the hybrid NFT ecosystem has been really excited about this, like the idea of being able to move from non-fungible to fungible tokens and assets. But I do think that's like the key difference is like ultimately, is there individuality to the asset? And if so, that's in the non-fungible category.
So, before joining the Solana ecosystem, I worked at Bison Trails. Bison Trails got its start as a blockchain infrastructure provider for validation nodes. So they ran block producing nodes for proof of stake networks, and that was sort of the core original. But they expanded very quickly into what we now consider in the Solana ecosystem RPC nodes, indexing services, sidecar data files, all that kind of stuff you need to be able to answer questions really quickly about what the state of a blockchain network is. And it always got me thinking that, we think of the internet as a read and write operation protocol. And that's true. And, famously, we add own and we get Web3. Read, write, own is sort of the conception here. But the vast majority of things that happen on the internet are still read operations. They're not write operations, right? If you are watching Netflix, that is purely a read operation. 99.99% of all data going over the internet is not writing something, it is reading something from somewhere else. And this is where we've seen the evolution of the CDN to be actually the data layer, the content delivery network on the internet that is responsible for most of our actual interaction. Like, you are very rarely talking to a server nowadays. You are that can actually has the authority to write data into a database. You are most often talking to a system where all it does is read a request and give you something back from that. I think we saw a little bit with compression, sort of like the version 0.5 flirting with the idea that data accessibility, it can be separated from the state of a network itself, right? Very famously, compressed NFTs, while those Merkle trees and the Merkle roots are stored on the Solana blockchain, the trees, exist in their uncompressed state on the RPC layer. They're not actually uncompressed on that core network. And so when you're reading data from a compressed NFT, you are reading data from an RPC server. You are not, quote unquote, reading data from the blockchain in the same way. And even though that whole tree can be rebuilt from the data that's stored on the blockchain, that's a very different paradigm. It seems like as we think about this world you're articulating, where the scope of what's considered to be a digital asset and all of the properties you may want to index or track or examine attached to a digital asset expands, that we may be looking at a slightly different system for how we're actually interacting with these digital assets over the long term.
I think that's right. The Solana runtime really is optimized for write performance. And there are NFT collectors that want to see the data for their asset fully stored in Solana account space. And so that's, we've seen the interest around inscriptions for really high value NFTs and assets. But that ends up being really expensive because that environment is not designed to optimize for reads. It's optimized for write performance. And so what compression then does is it stores just the minimal data necessary in order to keep that global state maintained on Solana, while then providing the RPC layer, which is indexing and then providing that performant access for applications. And like, this tension has been part of the Metaplex story from the very beginning. That first Metaplex storefront, if you remember, struggled to load. Like, that was the meme, is you would go to a Metaplex storefront and you'd be waiting for like minutes, and then like maybe a half an hour. And as the data increased, the indexing that was happening in real time and the get program accounts calls that were being made in real time, we're making it impossible for people to get the information that you need. Right. So it's obviously very valuable to get your transaction through and be able to write and like maintain the global state, but to deliver performant end user applications, you need to have a performant read layer. And progressively, we think that read layer will need to be more decentralized. And we think what we've built with DOS API really is like the beginning of a more decentralized way of indexing on-chain data that application developers can then use.
Yeah, it's funny because like for years I've been saying like someone needs to build a decentralized CDN layer on top of this stuff. And, there's all these things that like a lot of questions I've like asked myself over the years, like, why are there no video NFTs? And no, there are some video NFTs, but for the most part, we have GIFs as NFTs. If they have any motion in them at all, we don't have the ability, it seems like a no-brainer that I should be able to go and buy something from a very independent director, from a documentary that's like put out by a nonprofit potentially, that's not represented by a big studio. And like, why can't I buy that as an NFT? Because there are markets for these things in the traditional space. You can, or for music, right? I can go on any number of different marketplaces and I can spend $40 on one album, but I'm going to be getting, like 2 megabit per second FLAC files that come out of that. And if I'm that kind of nerd, that matters a lot to me. And blockchain seems like a very natural home for this. But for the most part, most NFT data is still fairly constrained and fairly limited today.
That's right. And decentralized file storage is the other piece of this.
Yeah.
So you have permanent file storage with IPFS and Arweave. And then you have the L1s, which provide you execution and managing global state. But there really is this gap that lives in the middle. And the RPC providers are currently delivering that gap. But when you have something like compression, which is generating like hundreds of millions of NFTs per month, you start to have like a pretty significant economic problem, which is like, who's paying for the storage of this data? What's supporting that at scale? And yes, you can replay the transactions to recompile that data, but like that doesn't really help if you're trying to serve a response time in a couple seconds or hopefully faster.
Yeah.
And I think that middle area will see a lot of innovation and like decentralized networks for delivering and serving that data. And we view the DOS API as like the first starting point to that.
Right. And just, some Metaplex history. We know it is fundamentally possible to do video NFTs because the first NFTs bought and sold on Solana were something like 4.7 gigabyte files.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. Shout out to Blondish.
Yeah, that original drop at Bitcoin Miami, each of those files was stored on Arweave, and they were multiple gigabytes. And the limiting factor there was they were very hard to consume because, first off, you can't load that much data into a Chrome extension. So the wallets weren't able to necessarily play them, but you had that reference point to say, here is my file stored on Arweave that I own, and I can go download it if I want to. But it wasn't, there was no CDN layer on top of it to make it consumable and playable and what we would all consider to be ownership, which is like if you buy a movie from iTunes, first off, you're licensing it, you're not buying it, but we'll set that aside for a second. They will serve you vastly different quality files depending on your available bandwidth and your device. And that whole layer doesn't really exist right now in blockchain.
That's right. Yeah, and there's no concept of like being on the edge of the network and being able to pay for better performance. And practically speaking, if the goal is censorship resistance, then you have to have decentralized solutions for delivering that data. And basically every crypto app in the world is now using centralized solutions for the indexing and distribution of the content in real time.
Yeah, fascinating. So, Stephen, where can people follow up on more developments of the Metaplex protocol?
So definitely follow us on X. It's at Metaplex. If you're a developer, come jump in on the Discord. A lot of folks building with Core, and we're there 24/7 around the clock if you need help. And in terms of the DAO, go to dao.metaplex.com to view the latest proposals, or mip.metaplex.com to submit a proposal. We're really excited. Appreciate having the opportunity to come here and talk with you today, but also looking forward to an amazing year and like this next leg in the journey for NFTs and digital assets for both Metaplex and Solana on large.
Awesome. Well, Stephen Hess, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Austin.